All right, so you want to get a handle on this whole US-China thing, right? I mean, it feels like it's impacting everything these days, from the tech we use to the news we read. But it can be overwhelming to even know where to start.
It really can. You get lost in the jargon and all these long reports, and it's hard to see the big picture.
Exactly. That's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We want to give you a clear and concise breakdown of what really matters in this global rivalry.
It's like your shortcut to understanding the core issues.
No headache required. So we've gone through a ton of analysis on this clash of the titans, as it's often called.
Yeah, we've done the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to.
And our mission today, it's pretty simple. We want to extract the most important insights, make the connections between these complex issues, and help you understand where these two giants are going head to head.
And what strategies they're using.
Exactly. And what the implications are for the whole world. I think you'll be surprised to see how interconnected everything really is.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tangled web, for sure.
So where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, a good place to start might be with China's economic transformation. For years, the prevailing image of China was as the world's factory.
Right. Pumping out cheap goods.
Yeah, exactly. But that picture is seriously outdated now.
Oh, totally outdated. Initiatives like Made in China 2025 really signaled a shift in their ambitions. They want to be a high-tech superpower.
No doubt about it.
And the numbers really back that up. I mean, just look at 2024. China was responsible for something like 29% of global industrial output.
That's huge.
It's massive, more than any other country in the world. And they're not just assembling products anymore. They're leading the way in a lot of key technologies.
Like 5G.
5G, absolutely. Shipbuilding is another one where they're really dominant. And when it comes to solar panels and EV batteries, their global lead is undeniable. It's a real shift in the landscape.
For sure. And a big part of that shift has been their huge investment in research and development. In 2023 alone, they poured about $450 billion into R&D.
Wow.
That kind of commitment tells you they're playing the long game. They're not just trying to catch up. They want to control the next wave of innovation.
And it's not just happening within their borders, right? They're expanding their reach globally. I mean, embedding their tech standards and platforms through these really strategic partnerships and investments.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
Everywhere. Think about companies like Huawei, BYD, Hair. They're not just selling products. They're establishing a global footprint for Chinese technology.
It's like building an ecosystem.
Exactly. And you see it in the infrastructure, too. Smart ports being built in places like Kenya. High-speed rail networks popping up in Southeast Asia, often built with Chinese tech and adhering to Chinese standards. It's a really strategic approach.
It is. And it's very different from how things were during the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
I mean, the Soviet bloc was pretty isolated economically. But China is deeply integrated into the global economy.
Totally different situation.
Yeah, it's way more complex now. And the potential consequences of any kind of major disruption are much bigger for everyone.
Definitely.
Okay, so speaking of complex, let's talk about semiconductors for a minute.
Okay, yeah, semiconductors.
These tiny little components, they're basically the foundation of our whole digital world. And China's making some serious moves in this area, especially considering the obstacles they're facing.
Major obstacles.
I mean, they've been hit with some pretty heavy U.S. export controls.
Yeah.
Especially on those advanced EUV lithography machines.
Right. Those are the really precise tools you need to make the most cutting-edge chips.
Exactly.
But despite all that, they hit a pretty big milestone in 2023.
Right, they did. What's amazing is how they've actually innovated under pressure. I mean, the Huawei Mate 60 Pro, it came out with a domestically produced 7-nanometer chip.
Made by SMIC?
Yes, manufactured by SMIC. And, just to give a little context here,
Yeah.
the smaller the nanometer number, the more advanced and efficient the chip is, generally speaking. So this 7-nanometer chip, it's not quite on par with the 3-nanometer tech that companies like TSMC are using.
Right.
But the fact that they managed to produce it using older DUV technology, I mean, that's less advanced lithography, it just shows their ingenuity. Like figuring out how to build a high-performance race car with a slightly older engine, it's pretty impressive.
It really shows their commitment to becoming self-sufficient in this critical technology. And it's not like it was just a one-off thing.
No.
They've been pouring massive investments into building their own domestic semiconductor industry. We're talking over $150 billion.
Yeah, they're not messing around. And their goal goes beyond just catching up. They want to create a whole ecosystem, designing chips, manufacturing them, producing the equipment and materials, the whole shebang.
Which raises some interesting questions about what's going to happen to global tech supply chains, right?
Definitely. Their stated goal is to basically wean themselves off foreign semiconductors. In fact, they want to become a net exporter within the next decade. If they pull that off, it's going to completely reshape the playing field in a sector that's crucial to pretty much all modern tech.
Everything. Phones, computers, military systems.
Everything.
So what about artificial intelligence? Because it doesn't stop with chips.
No, it doesn't. They're also making a big push in AI.
Yeah.
And the launch of DeepSeek R1 in 2025 was a pretty big deal.
What made it so significant?
Well, it's designed to go head-to-head with models like GPT-4. But there's a key difference. It's open source.
Oh, okay. So anyone can adapt it.
Exactly. So think of it like the Android operating system, but for AI.
Interesting.
It allows developing countries and businesses to take the core tech and customize it to their own needs without being locked into Western platforms, which could really shift the balance of power.
So it's kind of like they're exporting AI as soft power through that digital Silk Road they talk about.
It is.
They're not just offering physical infrastructure. They're providing the cloud computing resources, the AI development tools, the training, everything these countries need to build their own AI apps using Chinese technology.
And it all ties back into that broader tech ecosystem they're building.
Right.
You've got the hardware from companies like Huawei. You've got massive amounts of data coming from platforms like TikTok and WeChat. And now you have these sophisticated AI models that are open source. It's a compelling package, especially for countries that maybe don't fully trust Western tech providers.
So speaking of infrastructure, let's talk about the physical infrastructure that really underpins a lot of this. That Belt and Road Initiative they launched back in 2013, that's a truly massive undertaking.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
We're talking 150 countries. It's essentially a 21st century Silk Road. And it covers everything: railways, ports, energy pipelines, digital infrastructure, logistics hubs. They're connecting China to Europe through Central Asia with the Silk Road Economic Belt. And then they have the Maritime Silk Road that goes across the Indian Ocean to Africa and even into the Mediterranean. It's this web of connectivity spanning the globe.
And it's not just about trade, right?
Yeah, definitely not.
It's a way for them to build geopolitical influence.
It is.
A lot of these port projects,
Yeah.
like the ones in Gwadar, Piraeus, Hambantota, they're what they call dual use.
Right, meaning they could be used for military purposes as well, not just commercial.
Exactly.
And of course, China's providing the financing for these projects, long-term loans often using Chinese contractors and materials, which raises questions about the long-term financial burden on some of these countries. But one thing's for sure, the BRI is definitely reshaping global trade routes. It provides alternatives to those traditional choke points like the Suez and Panama Canals, and it gives China a more direct and strategic presence around the world.
So they're essentially creating a new geography of global commerce.
They are.
And on the digital side, they're building a parallel financial infrastructure, right?
Yes, through the digital Silk Road with CIPS at the center of it.
CIPS being that cross-border interbank payment system?
Right.
So how does that work?
So what makes CIPS so important is that it acts as an alternative to SWIFT.
Okay, which is that global system that pretty much everyone uses for international financial transactions.
Right. CIPS now connects over 110 countries and allows for cross-border payments in yuan.
Okay.
And unlike SWIFT, it's designed to handle both the messaging and the actual settlement of funds. So it reduces China's dependence on the U.S.-dominated financial system.
So it's like a separate highway for international payments,
Right.
but one that's backed by China. Okay, and then there's the digital yuan, the ECNY. Some say it's the most advanced central bank digital currency in the world right now.
It might be. I mean, they have pilot programs going on in all these cities. Millions of people are already using it.
Wow.
And the way they're integrating the ECNY into BRI projects and trade agreements is pretty game-changing.
So how does that work?
It's programmable, traceable. You can even use it offline.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So participating countries could potentially bypass Western banking systems entirely when they're dealing with China.
So between CIPS and the ECNY, they're building a pretty solid financial foundation for their global ambitions.
They are. It could be a real challenge to the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. We've talked about the Digital Silk Road. But there's another institution that China set up back in 2016, the AIIB.
The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was seen as a direct response to those established institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Right, the Bretton Woods institutions. So what's the AIIB all about?
Well, It's got over 100 member countries and $100 billion in capital. It funds infrastructure projects, often aligned with the BRI.
Okay.
And like with those physical infrastructure projects, Chinese companies and standards are often involved.
So how is it different from the World Bank or the IMF?
It's more politically flexible with its lending.
Okay.
They don't usually impose the same kind of austerity measures that you sometimes see with the IMF. And the loans often come with offers of Chinese tech and expertise.
It sounds like a package deal.
It is. And more, the financial side of these projects is being handled through the Chinese system. They're using CIPS for settlements, contracts and salaries are being paid in digital yuan. It all ties together.
It makes sense. So facing all this pressure and the trade war that the U.S. started, China's been working hard to reduce its vulnerabilities.
They have.
Especially its reliance on the American market and the U.S. financial system.
Right, which brings us to their dual circulation policy.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that mean?
Well, it's got two main parts. The first is all about boosting domestic consumption, making the internal market more resilient. And the second part is about diversifying their trade relationships, reducing their reliance on any single partner, especially the United States. And RCEP has played a key role in this.
Okay, RCEP being the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Right.
It's that massive trade deal with 15 nations in the Asia-Pacific region.
Exactly.
And it looks like it's having an impact.
Yeah.
By 2024, China's trade with RCEP countries was over $1.2 trillion, more than 30% of their total exports.
Right. And at the same time, their trade with the U.S. has been declining.
So it's working.
It seems to be. They're also expanding those BRI trade corridors, doing more business in yuan, using local currencies with partners like Brazil and Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. They're locking in long-term deals for essential stuff. Energy, commodities, high-tech components, all with countries that aren't necessarily in the U.S. camp.
So they're really building a whole alternative system.
They are. It's about creating options.
Okay, now let's talk about something interesting. China's activity in the gold market and what they're doing with U.S. Treasury bonds. They've been quietly offloading those bonds for a while now.
They have. It's been pretty steady. I mean, back in 2013, they had something like $1.3 trillion in U.S. Treasuries.
Wow.
By 2024, that was down to under $775 billion.
That's a big drop.
Yeah. It's not just about diversifying their reserves. It's also a way to reduce their exposure to U.S. sanctions.
And the ups and downs of the dollar.
Exactly.
So at the same time, they've been aggressively increasing their gold holdings. Officially, they've got over 2,300 metric tons. But there's speculation that the real number could be much higher.
Right, because gold is seen as that ultimate sovereign asset.
Yeah.
It exists outside the Western-controlled financial system.
Okay.
And by stocking up on gold and pushing the yuan in international trade, potentially even backing it with gold, they're chipping away at the dollar's dominance.
It's a long game. So let's talk about another maybe less obvious, but incredibly powerful form of leverage that China has. Rare earths.
Ah, yes. The rare earth elements.
Essential for so many modern technologies.
They are. Smartphones, wind turbines, electric vehicles, even military hardware, you need rare earths for all of them. And China controls a huge chunk of the entire supply chain.
How much?
Over 70% of global mining and more than 85% of refining capacity. For some of the heavy rare earths, it's over 90%.
Wow.
This didn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's been a strategic, long-term play by China.
Yeah.
And it gives them immense control over a vital resource.
And we've seen them use that leverage before.
Oh, yeah.
Like with Japan in 2010, and more recently with those export controls on gallium and germanium. That really hit Western semiconductor supply chains.
It did. And it highlights a real vulnerability for the West.
Right.
Efforts to build domestic rare earth supply chains in the U.S. and Europe are still in their early stages. And China's busy securing access to these resources all over the world.
Yeah.
It creates a strategic imbalance.
It does. So let's shift gears a little and talk about active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. Not as flashy as rare earths, maybe, but just as critical.
Absolutely. These are the essential components that actually make our medicines work.
And China's role here is often overlooked.
It is.
But it's a major vulnerability. They produce something like 40% of all global APIs. And for some essential medicines, it's as high as 70 to 90%.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Even India, which is a major pharmaceutical producer, relies heavily on China for APIs. So it creates this web of dependence.
And the COVID-19 pandemic really exposed the risks. Even those temporary disruptions in China caused shortages of vital medicines in other parts of the world.
It did.
And while there's been a push to bring some pharmaceutical production back to the West, progress has been slow.
It has. And China's only expanding its footprint in this sector.
It has huge implications for public health, for national security.
For everything, really.
It does. Okay, so China's making moves in pharmaceuticals, rare earths, semiconductors. What about electric vehicles?
So they're all over that.
Are they?
They're making huge strides in EVs, batteries, and even factory automation. And BYD is a great example of this.
BYD, the car company.
Right. They've become a real powerhouse in the global EV market. They even outsold Tesla in 2023.
Wow.
Their business model is vertically integrated, meaning they control everything from the batteries to the cars themselves. And their blade battery technology is really innovative.
So they're leading the way in EV battery tech.
Oh yeah, China's got a real lock on the whole supply chain.
Wow.
Companies like CATL have huge global market share.
Okay.
And they've been very strategic about securing those raw materials,
Right, locking in those long-term contracts for the minerals they need.
Exactly. And it allows them to mass produce very competitive electric vehicles.
And they're selling those EVs all over the world now.
They are. And they're using sophisticated AI in their factories to keep costs down and boost efficiency. It's a pretty impressive operation.
Okay, so let's shift our focus a bit and talk about what's happening in the maritime domain. China's string of pearls strategy and their ambitions in those island chains in the Pacific. These are big geopolitical moves.
They are. So the string of pearls, that refers to this network of ports and infrastructure projects that stretches all the way from East Asia through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, into the Middle East, and even Africa.
It's a string of pearls.
It is.
Wow, okay.
Officially, these are commercial ventures.
Right.
But locations like Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Djibouti, where they've got a military base,
Yeah.
these could also serve as strategic hubs for the Chinese Navy, for logistics, for refueling.
So they're like strategically positioned stepping stones across the globe.
Exactly. And then you have their goal of breaking through the first and second island chain.
Okay, and remind me what those are.
Those are essentially lines of U.S. allied territories that stretch across the Western Pacific.
Okay.
And by pushing through those chains, China's basically aiming to project its naval power further into the Pacific.
Makes sense.
And the way they're militarizing islands in the South China Sea and building ties with those Pacific island nations, it all points in the same direction.
So they're playing the long game.
Definitely. But it's important to remember that China's got its own economic challenges to deal with, too. Deflation's been a big concern.
Yeah.
Since mid-2023, we've seen consumer and producer prices falling. It's a sign of weak demand and low consumer confidence.
Right.
Retail sales have been sluggish, wages haven't really grown, and those problems in the housing market.
Those are still going on.
They are. And they're definitely having an impact on spending and economic activity.
Makes sense. Okay, so given everything we've talked about, how has China responded to those U.S. tariffs and the trade war? Because they haven't just sat back and taken it.
No, not at all. They've hit back with their own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, especially agriculture and energy.
Okay.
They've also used export controls on those critical minerals we talked about. But maybe even more importantly, they've really ramped up efforts to build trade ties with countries outside the U.S.
So external circulation.
Exactly. Targeting regions like Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. They're looking for alternative markets and partners.
Yeah.
And we're seeing more and more trade deals settled in yuan or even local currencies, sometimes even backed by gold. It's all part of this effort to move away from the dollar-dominated system.
So beyond all the economic and military maneuvering, there's a whole other dimension to this rivalry, what some call asymmetric warfare, espionage, propaganda, disinformation.
Yeah.
The FBI has said that a majority of their foreign counterintelligence investigations these days involve China. They're targeting aerospace, AI, pharmaceuticals, quantum computing, all these sensitive sectors.
It's a big concern.
Yeah.
And then you have their state-controlled media and other channels that are constantly working to promote their narrative.
It's sophisticated.
It is. They're using these fake social media accounts, bot networks, even AI-generated content to try and sway public opinion and potentially even interfere in elections, including in the U.S.
So how has the U.S. responded to all of this? Because it's pretty clear they're not just sitting back and watching.
Oh, no, they're not. They've got a multi-front counteroffensive going on.
Okay, what does that look like?
Well, they're trying to bolster domestic industries through things like industrial policy. They're strengthening alliances with key partners.
Right.
They're leveraging their power in the global financial system. And they're working hard to secure control of those vital resources. Their aim is to not just contain China's rise, but actually reverse some of the gains they've made.
So this is a different kind of competition compared to the Cold War.
It is. It's more about data control, semiconductor leadership, securing sea lanes, access to minerals, dominating digital infrastructure.
Okay.
It's asymmetric.
So one of the first and most visible things the U.S. did was impose those tariffs on a huge range of Chinese goods. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of stuff.
Right.
And that was under the Trump administration.
It was.
But those tariffs are mostly still in place today.
Many of them are, which shows there's bipartisan support for addressing the trade imbalance.
Okay. So what else has the U.S. done?
Well, they've also implemented what some call a tech siege.
Okay. What does that mean?
They're trying to block China's access to those advanced semiconductor technologies and the equipment they need to make them.
Right, like those EUV lithography machines.
Exactly. It's having a real impact on China's ambitions in areas like AI and quantum computing.
Okay.
And then the U.S. has also been using its control over the global financial system.
Right. What's called the dollar noose.
Exactly. They can use the threat of sanctions and other financial penalties to influence global capital flows and limit China's access to funding, particularly in those sensitive tech sectors.
So the U.S. is flexing its muscles, basically.
They are.
Okay, so in all of this, India has emerged as a really important player for the U.S., right?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
So why is India so important?
Well, they've got that strategic location,
Right.
a large and growing economy, and their own concerns about China's influence.
Right.
It makes them a natural partner for the U.S. And we've seen military ties strengthen, more joint exercises. They're working together to position India as that attractive China plus one destination for supply chains that are looking to diversify.
Okay.
India could become a major manufacturing hub for pharmaceuticals, electronics, cars, all sorts of things.
So the U.S. is also focused on strengthening its own critical industries, right? Those fortress sectors.
Right. They're looking at semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, particularly those APIs, automobiles, steel, energy, critical minerals. They're trying to reduce their reliance on China.
And make themselves more resilient.
Exactly.
So what are they doing to achieve that?
Well, you've got things like the TIPS Act, which is pumping money into domestic semiconductor production.
Right.
They're trying to revive API production in the U.S. and in India. And they're pushing for Buy American policies to support domestic industries.
So when it comes to energy and those critical minerals, the U.S. is trying to break China's dominance, right?
They are.
They're trying to secure those alternative supply chains.
Exactly. So they're investing in mining projects in places like Chile, Argentina, Greenland, across Africa, often through partnerships like the Mineral Security Partnership.
Okay.
And they're pushing to speed up mining projects here in the U.S. At the same time, they're working to assert control over those vital energy choke points.
Like the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea.
Yeah.
They're doing this through alliances and partnerships. And there are reports that they're even involved in some covert operations to destabilize China's alternative energy corridors.
Right.
Places like Pakistan, Myanmar, and of course there's the ongoing pressure on Iran.
It's getting complicated.
It is.
So we've talked about strengthening domestic industries, securing resources. What about alliances? Because the U.S. has really been doubling down on its alliances, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the QID with India, Japan, and Australia. And AUKUS, that's with Australia and the UK.
Right. These alliances are crucial to the U.S. strategy for projecting power and deterring any potential aggression by China in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay.
They're cooperating on maritime security, tech development, vaccine distribution, even coordinating their efforts to decouple from China economically.
So a united front.
Essentially. And IFUS in particular focuses on sharing really advanced military technologies.
Like what?
Things like AI, cyber warfare tools, quantum technologies, hypersonic weapons, undersea surveillance.
Wow.
And Australia is getting access to nuclear submarine technology through IUCAP.
Okay. So there's also this whole other element we've seen reported, which is the use of, let's call them disrupt and deny tactics.
Right.
Potentially using proxy groups to target those key Chinese energy and infrastructure corridors in Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So the idea is to use these groups to create instability, drive up costs for China, make their infrastructure projects less reliable.
It's a way to make things more difficult for them.
Exactly. So, for example, there's talk of U.S. support for Balak separatists who oppose the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Right.
And there are reports of the U.S. maybe trying to exploit ISIS-K in Afghanistan to disrupt China's ambitions in the rare earth sector there.
And, of course, the ongoing efforts to put pressure on Iran.
It's like a shadow war.
It is.
Okay. We've also seen reports of the U.S. trying to increase its influence in those countries that border China,
Right.
especially around the Bay of Bengal.
Right. The goal there seems to be disrupting China's eastern access routes.
Okay.
So you've got diplomatic engagement, support for those ethnic militias in Myanmar that are fighting against Chinese-backed projects. And they're putting pressure on Bangladesh over its port development deals with China, while at the same time trying to incentivize closer ties with the U.S.
Okay.
And India's naval strength in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands plays a big role in this strategy, too.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
It is.
So then in the Pacific, the U.S. is really reinforcing that island chain firewall idea, right?
Yeah.
Working to fortify those U.S.-aligned territories that stretch from Japan down to the Philippines.
Exactly. So they're expanding U.S. military bases in Japan. They're supporting Japan's own military buildup. And they're increasing cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea.
Yeah.
The Philippines is back in the fold, too.
How so?
They're giving the U.S. more access to their bases. And they've resumed joint patrols in the South China Sea. The aim is to create this strong defensive line along that first island chain.
Okay. So then in the U.S.'s own backyard, Latin America, it seems like they're bringing back a kind of Neo-Monroe doctrine.
It does seem that way. They're pushing back against both China and Russia down there. So they're countering Chinese investments, offering alternative financing through institutions like the DFC.
The Development Finance Corporation.
Right. And they're also trying to destabilize those regimes in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba that have sided with Beijing or Moscow.
It's getting messy.
It is.
Okay, so when you put all this together, it's clear that the U.S. is trying to build a whole alternative system, a parallel world, to counter China's initiatives.
They are.
So the BRI.
They're countering that with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. And before that, there was the BUILD.
Not just talking about it, they're actually doing it. I mean, look at the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the PGII.
Yeah.
You know, it's all about offering countries a different way to develop, a different path than what China's offering. And it's not just about, throwing money at infrastructure projects. It's about doing it transparently and sustainably.
Yeah, and, and it's not just like empty promises either.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about real projects, building digital connections, modernizing energy grids, ports, railways, especially in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. It's almost like they're trying to build a whole, separate physical and digital infrastructure, like a counterweight to what China's already built.
That's a good way to put it. And the digital part of it is huge.
Yeah.
You've got the Clean Network Initiative where they're, trying to keep Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE out of critical infrastructure.
Right.
And it's not just about security. It's about, building trust in these digital pathways, making sure that data and communication are flowing between allies.
So it's like building a whole separate digital world. It's not just about keeping certain players out. It's about creating a whole new system, right?
Exactly. And then you've got the resources angle, which is fascinating, too. I mean, China right now has a stranglehold on a lot of the, rare earth elements and, battery metals that we need for everything, from, electric cars to all the, fancy electronics we use.
Right.
And the U.S. is not just sitting back and, letting that happen. They're actively investing in mining ventures in places like Chile, Greenland, sub-Saharan Africa, you know. The goal is to create a, more diverse supply chain for these critical materials, one that's not so reliant on China.
It's almost like a self-contained system, right?
It is. They talk about a closed-loop supply chain where everything from, mining to processing to manufacturing happens within a network of allied nations. It's about reducing dependence on China and building a more secure, independent base. So, yeah, it's not just about economic competition. It's about building a whole separate system for infrastructure resources, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. So, I mean, this is getting pretty intense, huh?
It is.
And it's not just about, like, the physical stuff either, right?
Yeah.
Like all the infrastructure and the resources. It's about ideas, too. It's about information. It's like China's been playing a really long game when it comes to shaping global perceptions.
Absolutely. It's beyond just the trade and infrastructure. It's about, winning hearts and minds. And they're using everything they've got, from state-backed media like CGTN and Xinhua to, sophisticated bot networks and influencer campaigns on social media.
I mean, wow. It's a really impressive effort when you think about it. And it's not just aimed at governments or, international organizations. They're targeting public opinion across the board.
Yeah.
From developing countries to the West even. And the narratives that they're pushing, China is this, benevolent actor, pointing out Western hypocrisy, talking about a, multipolar world.
Yeah.
All that stuff, it seems to be resonating with a lot of different people.
And what's really interesting is how deep it goes. I mean, these narratives are showing up everywhere, universities, Hollywood, TikTok, even, encrypted messaging apps. It's crazy. It's like they're trying to create this whole global environment that's, favorable to China's rise and maybe even, sow some division in the West.
Right, right. And the U.S., I mean, they're not, just letting this happen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like they're doing a lot to try and, counter this information offensive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They've got a pretty sophisticated counter-disinformation strategy going on. You've got the Global Engagement Center, the GEC at the State Department. They're, constantly trying to, expose what they see as Chinese propaganda and disinformation.
Right.
And then they're working closely with, the big tech companies like Meta, Google, Microsoft, to try and, detect and dismantle these influence campaigns on their platforms. And then you've got Congress, they're paying a lot more attention to, Chinese funding and influence in universities, think tanks, all that. It's like a constant back and forth, a battle for the narrative.
A battle for hearts and minds. Yeah.
Exactly. And some people are even saying that, the intelligence agencies are getting more involved too, using things like psychological operations, PSYOPs to try and, counter specific narratives in, key regions. It's all about, reinforcing democratic values and pushing back against what they see as an authoritarian challenge.
Okay, so from the the battle for narratives, we're now moving into something that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction, but it's becoming more and more real, and that's this whole thing about space. The militarization of space. It's a big part of this rivalry now.
Yeah, I mean it's not just about exploring the cosmos anymore. It's a strategic domain, The military relies heavily on satellites for everything, GPS, missile tracking, intelligence communications, and whoever controls space basically has a huge advantage down here on Earth.
Yeah, and China's been, really stepping up their game in space, right?
Yeah.
You've got the Tiangong space station, the Beidou navigation system. They're clearly investing a lot in building up their own, independent space capabilities.
Yeah, they're not messing around. And then you've got Russia, too. They've been testing anti-satellite weapons. They're developing these, so-called killer satellites that can, take out other satellites. It's definitely gotten the U.S.'s attention.
Yeah. So, I mean, what are they doing about it? They're not just, sitting back and watching, are they?
No, they're not. I mean, they've created the U.S. Space Force. They've beefed up U.S. Space Command, Spacecom, to, oversee military operations in space. But it's not just the government. They're working closely with private companies, too, like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Lockheed Martin, to develop, more resilient satellites, systems that can be deployed quickly.
Right.
Like Starlink, for example, it's providing internet access, but it's also got, military applications in terms of, secure communications.
And what about those Artemis Accords? It seems like that's their way of trying to, set the rules of the road for space, for exploration, for using resources, all that.
Yeah, exactly. The Artemis Accords are basically a U.S.-led initiative to, establish some kind of frameworks and principles for, what you can and can't do in space, including things like, extracting resources from the moon and other places. And it's seen as a way to, get ahead of China and Russia, who are, trying to set up their own, governance structures in space. So, yeah, it's a whole new kind of space race, and the stakes are really high.
Okay, so we've got these parallel systems emerging in infrastructure, in information, and now in space too. So it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. But let's bring it back down to Earth for a second and talk about, how this rivalry is affecting global alliances and supply chains.
Yeah.
Because it really does feel like the world is splitting into two camps.
Yeah, it does. And, it's becoming more and more clear that this great power competition is basically a contest between two, coalitions. On one side, you've got the U.S. and all its allies, the EU, India, Japan, Australia, Israel, South Korea, the Philippines, and they're all linked together through, treaties and alliances, You've got the Quad, AUKUS, NATO, the Five Eyes, the Mineral Security Partnership. Pretty impressive network.
A pretty impressive network.
It is. And they're all working together to, shape international standards, coordinate investments, make sure supply chains are secure, maintain their dominance in maritime security. It's a very, interconnected web of alliances.
So what's the, the overall goal of this bloc? What are they trying to achieve?
Basically, they want to, maintain the rules-based international order, and provide a counterweight to China's, growing power. And then on the other side, you've got what you might call China's sphere of influence.
Okay.
And this includes countries like Russia, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, Turkey, and then a lot of countries in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia that are, heavily invested in, the Belt and Road Initiative and other Chinese projects.
So it's a bit more of a loose grouping, right? It's not like a formal alliance like NATO or something.
Exactly. It's more about, shared interests, a desire to, push back against the West. And they're using different tools, too.
Yeah.
They're using disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, They're leveraging their position in global commodity markets.
Right. And then you've got, all the trade disputes that have been happening over the past few years. That's really accelerated this whole trend towards, breaking up global supply chains. I mean, we're seeing, countries bringing manufacturing back home or to, friendly countries.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. is, they're really pushing this. They've got the Chip 4 Alliance to boost semiconductor manufacturing, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, to strengthen ties with Asian partners, the Inflation Reduction Act, with all its incentives for green energy production, They're trying to bring back critical industries.
Right.
And they're also, putting restrictions on Chinese tech companies, trying to build a more secure tech base at home.
And there's this whole China plus one strategy where they're encouraging allies to diversify their supply chains, find alternative production hubs in places like India, Vietnam, Mexico. Yeah. It's all about reducing dependence on China, right?
Exactly. But, China's not just, sitting back and watch. They're adapting, too. I mean, they're still dominant in a lot of key sectors, like semiconductors, batteries, rare earth processing,
Right.
And they're pushing their own digital ecosystems,
Yeah.
They've got their own payment systems like CIPS and the digital yuan, So they're trying to create their own, parallel financial system outside of, the Western-dominated one.
So it really does seem like we're headed towards two separate global economies, with different standards, different supply chains, different ways of doing business.
Yeah, that's where we seem to be headed. And all this trade tension has, basically opened the door to a much bigger geopolitical contest. I mean, it's not just about, tariffs and trade deficits anymore. It's about, military posturing in, places like the South China Sea. It's about proxy conflicts,
Yeah.
And it's about, this race for dominance in, technology space, cyber AI, and of course you can't forget about Taiwan. That's a major flashpoint.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really volatile situation. So how do you see this playing out? I mean, we've got the U.S., doing its containment thing with, alliances like IUU sanctions, all that. And then you've got China, building up its own, counterbalancing forces with Russia, Pakistan, reaching out to the Middle East.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear that, the days of, one global superpower, calling all the shots are over. We're definitely moving into a, bipolar world, The U.S. and China as the two poles,
Yeah.
Each with its own, system, its own block of allies, its own ideology, But then there's this whole other group of countries, the so-called third pole. These are countries that aren't, firmly in either camp.
And who are these countries? I mean, who are the major players in this third pole?
Well, you've got India. Yeah. They've got a complicated relationship with China, but they're trying to maintain their independence.
Right.
You've got Russia, they're getting closer to China, but they still have their own agenda. You've got the Gulf states, the GCC, they're becoming more assertive. And then you've got big players like Indonesia, Brazil,
Right.
These third pole countries, they're basically trying to, play both sides, maximize their own benefits without getting too dependent on either the U.S. or China. And they could actually become really important, They could be the ones who decide how this whole thing shakes out.
Wow. So the next decade is going to be really interesting, huh? It's not just about what the U.S. and China do. It's about what these third pole countries do, too.
Exactly. It's going to be a very dynamic, very unpredictable landscape.
Okay. So ultimately, this whole, U.S.-China competition is about, who's going to shape the future of the world. So let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. What are the main advantages that each side brings to this, this global chess match?
Well, the U.S., they still have a lot going for them. They've got this, vast network of alliances. They've got, a really innovative tech sector. They're still at the center of the global financial system.
Right.
But China, they've come a long way really fast. They're a technological and industrial powerhouse. They can reshape supply chains. They're influencing international standards. They're building their own financial systems.
Right.
And they're really good at adapting to changing circumstances.
So they're both formidable players.
Oh, absolutely. This is a clash of the titans, you know?
It is. So what's the U.S.'s game plan? What are they trying to do to stay ahead in this rivalry?
Well, it seems like their main focus is on, reindustrializing their economy, bring back manufacturing jobs. They want to, restructure global trade to benefit them more.
Right.
And they want to, reassert their leadership in all these new cutting edge fields, data, green energy, AI,
Right.
They see control of these, critical resources as, the key to winning this rivalry. Things like semiconductors, rare earth minerals, control of the digital platforms, control of green technology, AI,
Right. So basically they're trying to, make it harder for China to keep rising, to limit their influence, to create an environment where China's ambitions are kind of stifled.
Exactly. They want to make it clear that, challenging the U.S.-led order comes at a price.
Okay, so it sounds like we're headed for a world that's, a lot more divided than the one we've been living in. It's like we're moving towards a dual-track globalization, where you've got, two sets of rules, two sets of standards, two sets of supply chains.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment. And it's going to be a lot more complicated to navigate.
Yeah, no kidding. And the stakes are really high. This is about the future of the world order.
Yeah.
It's about, democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about who sets the rules of the road for the 21st century.
Exactly. And the choices that these, third pole countries make, that's going to be crucial. It's a very, very complex picture.
Yeah, it is. So as we wrap up this, this deep dive, the main takeaway here is that, we're seeing these parallel worlds emerge.
Yeah.
In every domain you can think of.
Yeah.
Economics, technology, information, even space.
Yeah. And it's all driven by this rivalry between the U.S. and China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener,
Yeah.
as you think about all this, about these parallel worlds being built, what do you see as the biggest opportunities, the biggest risks? What does it mean for different countries? What does it mean for the future of, international cooperation? It's something to really think about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.